If you've clicked on this video, you probably already know who the Quakers are, or you're one of my loyal fans who likes the quality of my videos and assumes this one will be good. Many of you in both categories are probably wondering why I made a whole two-parter timeline centering around this small division of Christians originally from northern England, who most people haven't even heard of. How could they ever be historically decisive? For those of you who don't know, the Quakers are a religious denomination of Protestantism founded in 17th century northern England. They in general believe in the principles of the spices, or simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. As a form of worship, they gather in plain meeting houses and contemplate God in silence, often without a minister or any formal prayer. They still exist with a global population of around 377,000, and their four biggest countries being Kenya, the US, Burundi, and Bolivia. What would happen if a small religious branch most people have never heard of never existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? The answers may surprise you. For this timeline to start, the founder of Quakerism, George Fox, is simply never born or never founds Quakerism. Without him, we can be very certain there'd be no similar religion, since Quakerism is a very unique religion, and its existence is probably a statistical oddity. History would not be very different for the next 40 years. The Quakers were picking up support and were parts of the 17th century English scene, but did not make history-changing switches yet. King Charles II was in debt to the Penn family because of their services in the Navy and for some money he had borrowed from them. He himself was pretty low on cash, and so he gave William Penn, the heir to the debt, the state of Pennsylvania as compensation. It used to bother me that the King of England simply gave away a region almost as large as England on a whim, but it was far away from him. It happened that William Penn was a Quaker, and so founded Pennsylvania as a colony for the Quakers. I'm going to use a widely accepted but not completely agreed upon theory for this video. I'm just warning that this theory is not complete textbook material, but it's important to the flow of this alternate history. I'm referring to the American nations theory, which says America is divided into different cultural regions that date back to colonial days and perhaps regions in the British Isles. This theory is wonderfully proposed in David Hackett Fisher's book, Albion's Seed, and slightly worse in Colin Woodward's book, American Nations. This theory generally divides the eastern United States into certain regions, of which I made a map of right in front of you. Once we get west of the plains, the cultures start to mix into new combinations, based mainly off climate and geography, and people stop agreeing. According to this theory, New England was settled by Puritans from East Anglia, who created the culture of New England and parts of the upper Midwest. Virginia by the South English, who created the cultural framework for the Chesapeake region. Appalachia was settled by people from the Scottish borderlands, and Northern Ireland, who created the northern-southern culture that stretches from Appalachia to Texas. The Deep South was settled by Huguenots, Barbadians, and Virginians, who created the culture of the coastal Deep South, while Pennsylvania, meanwhile, was settled by Quakers, mainly from northern England, North Englishmen friendly to Quakers, and Rhineland Germans who founded the modern culture of the Mid-Atlantic and most of the Midwest. I divided the upper Midwest between the New Englanders and the Midlanders on this map, since I feel they might have aspects of both cultures. Each of these regions has a profound mark on American culture and society as we know it today. If William Penn was not a Quaker, he would have probably treated Pennsylvania like every other English nobleman who had received a ridiculously large slice of North America, by completely ignoring it and letting the colonists figure it out themselves. The Quaker migration, and as you will see in next video, the German migration, were dependent on William Penn being a Quaker, and so the Mid-Atlantic, Midwest culture we saw in our timeline would never exist. This would completely change American history. I don't mean to offend anyone who is not part of this cultural group, but the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, California group has been effectively the dominant cultural and economic group for much of American history, and so just removing it would take America in a very different direction. Pennsylvania would probably be settled by different groups without the Quakers. Southerners would settle in the lower Delaware Valley, and Scots-Irish Appalachians would settle the rest of the lower parts of the state, while New Englanders would probably settle more of the north of the state. The Revolution would still work in this timeline, since the middle colonies were the most loyal to Britain in our timeline, and without that, the Revolution might actually have been easier for the Americans to win. After the Revolution, the Loyalists to the British Crown fled north to Britain's possession in Canada, settling in southern Ontario. This is what created Anglo-Canada as we know it besides the Maritimes. These Loyalists mainly came from the more Crown-friendly Mid-Atlantic colonies. This is what southern Ontario has a vaguely similar culture to the Mid-Atlantic and the Midwest. Afterwards, many immigrants came from Britain and other countries, but they filled the cultural footprint left by the first settlers. Thus, without the Mid-Atlantic existing, Canada as we know it would never exist. In our timeline, the Mid-Atlantic and Central Midwest acted as a mediator between New England and the South. It almost always took a middle road politically, and if you just look at a map of the swing states, a great many are in this region. Just imagine how contested American politics would be if only New England, the upper Midwest, the South, and West were in politics. This would probably mean that after the Revolution, New England and the South would probably split into different regions without the mediating influence of the middle states. Pennsylvania is called the Keystone State for a reason. The issues of federalism versus anti-federalism and Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian democracy would tear the nation apart. The South and New England would have differing claims on the West, with New England states and New York claiming the Midwestern territory that Virginia would also claim. This would likely result in a war between the two nations in the early 19th century. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a complete Southern worshipper, but the South would definitely win the war. To explain why, I'll give an example. Almost all good generals in America were from the South or Southern families. Robert E. Lee, Washington, Patton, Andrew Jackson, Winfield Scott, Zachary Taylor, Eisenhower, Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, etc. I don't know how to explain this, but something the South's culture simply creates better generals than the North on average. Also, the South seems to have larger officer percentages in the Army than the North does. This was shown in the Civil War, where the South had better leadership. Hell, Andrew Jackson would have probably fought in the war against New England. The reason I've had the South lose many wars in other alternate histories is that by the time we hit the late 19th century, the North is simply so much larger industrially and economically that it could crush the South. But in a war before industrialization, a united South would have defeated New England. Also, the North would be significantly smaller, with much of Pennsylvania falling into Southern hands, and both sides would be roughly equivalent in manpower and economic strength. The South would likely annex all the lands to the west of probably Cleveland and Erie. The culture of the Midwest would be wildly different in this timeline. Without the Mid-Atlanticers who laid the foundation of Midwestern culture, we would have seen the area settled by Appalachians. States like Illinois, Ohio, or Wisconsin would be more like Kentucky or Tennessee. The New England diaspora would still happen, or, for those of you that don't know, when New Englanders settled the upper Midwest in the early 19th century. However, it would be much smaller. In my What If the New England Seceded in the War of 1812 timeline, I said the New England diaspora would still happen unabated. What would the difference be? Firstly, there would be a much greater difference between New Englanders and Appalachians than there is between Midlanders and Appalachians. Thus, it would be harder for New Englanders to sneak into the South and take land as foreigners. Also, the Appalachians hated New Englanders, and so the state legislatures would try to put New Englanders at a disadvantage. The Rust Belt would have never existed in this timeline. I don't want to offend anyone here, but traditional Southern culture was not conducive to industrialization. Kentucky and Virginia could have industrialized just as easy as New York and Ohio, but never did. The most industrialized part of America also very closely matched the part of America settled by Quakers. The Iron States, or Rust Belt states, exist because of cultural factors that would have not existed in this timeline. Since for much of America's history, the Rust Belt was by far the most industrialized part of America, around World War I being around two-thirds of the entire continent's industrial power. Without the Rust Belt being industrialized, America would be a far less industrialized country. Without the original Loyalist settlers, southern Ontario would instead likely be originally settled by Appalachians and New Englanders from America. With both sides busy fighting each other, no one would have purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French. The British would have seized the region from the French during the Napoleonic Wars, when they would have had naval superiority. To summarize something I already explained in my What If a United America Collapsed in the 18th Century video, the South would feel as though it was surrounded on all sides, and would declare war on Britain. Even though it would be later than our timeline's War of 1812, due to the shadow of the war with New England, and our timeline's War of 1812 mainly being concerned with maritime issues which would not worry the South, thus meaning the South would likely have better generals than our timeline's War of 1812. Also,
Tecumseh would have been defeated in some unrelated Indian war. The British Army would not be geared in total war mode from the Napoleonic Wars, but on the other hand, the British would not be completely exhausted from the Napoleonic Wars. The South would likely conquer or lightly garrison the Louisiana Territory and invade Canada. With the population of southern Ontario mainly being American, they would rebel in favor of the American invaders, similarly to what happened in the Mexican-American War in our timeline with Texas. The Americans would likely be stopped by serious British forces before conquering Montreal, however, due to the distance from the American supply centers in Michigan. The British would likely counterattack in Canada, the Mid-Atlantic, and Louisiana after this. Just like in our timeline, the Louisiana counterattack would fail. The Canadian one would end in a bloody standstill in eastern Ontario, with the British being better trained and fighting on their home soil, but the Americans closer to their home front and better led. The Chesapeake front would likely end up with the British seizing Washington and maybe Baltimore, but probably being stopped before reaching Philadelphia. Then it would turn into a Crimea, with the British Army unable to reach any major goals, but Americans unable to defeat them for the rest of the war. The war would likely end with the U.S. taking Canada west of Quebec and gaining the Louisiana Territory. I know this sounds absurd, but this timeline will be continued in a part 2. See what's going on in England and how strangely America will turn out, coming out soon.